Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Lucklight Plays. We are starting a new series here on 8-Bit Obscurity, and you probably recognize that music very well, as it is the prelude theme to Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy is the farthest thing from obscure, and I understand that. But I am playing Final Fantasy III, which was, out of the prequel 3 games on the regular Nintendo, this was the one we got last. And we never got in this kind of version. We never got the Nintendo version. So this is a translated version of Final Fantasy III. I'm gonna give you a, as I name my characters here and give you, start the game, I'm gonna actually give you a brief, partial rundown of my history of Final Fantasy, as Final Fantasy has been my go-to RPG since I was a very, very young child. I'm just gonna name my characters here after myself and my buddies. And you remember some of these names from previous playthroughs, I bet. And the fourth one, what should we name the fourth one? Let's call him Shade. Alright, so, this gameplay is a lot different from the one that we got on iOS, 3DS, well actually regular DS, and the one just recently on Steam. Recently-ish. You start with all 4 characters, and you get your first jobs right away. But brief history of my history on Final Fantasy. I would say 1985 I was born, and when I was born, we didn't have a Nintendo. Nintendos were actually rather new at the time. But I think it was around like 87, 88 we got ourselves a Nintendo. And it was mainly my older sisters, but I think I started playing it roughly around, maybe I was 4 or 5. And the first video game I ever played was actually Final Fantasy 1. We had Mario, we had, I think, the original Legend of Zelda, we had, I think we had, like, Tetris, we had Dragon Quest 1, you know, all those games, and, I used to watch them be played by my parents, my sister, and I never really played anything. I just kind of watched. I was too young for it, I didn't really care for it, I wanted to, you know, I wanted to watch, like Nickelodeon or Rugrats or something, and I remember starting to play video games, and the first game I played was the original Final Fantasy, which I had a general gist of what I was supposed to do in RPGs, but I never tried one at that point. So when I finally did pick it up, I had a rough time. But I knew that I had to level, and the more you leveled, the more you got stronger, the easier the game would be. Got all that. Beat the game. It took me a while, a long while. I beat it, you know, thanks to help from my father, help from my sister, whatever. And I finally beat it. A few years later, you know, no new Final Fantasy, etc. We almost forgot about it. I think fast forward to about 1991, I believe. And right around that time, we got a new Final Fantasy, labeled Final Fantasy II. And that was for the Super Nintendo, and, you know, one of the biggest achievements in the first game, for me at least, was picking up the airship. And when you got the airship, it felt great. You're like, now I can go anywhere, I can land anywhere, everything's gonna be super cool now. And when I opened Final Fantasy II, or what I knew then as Final Fantasy II, it started with 5 airships flying north, and this cool music playing, and I was like, whoa! You know, whatever's going on here must be serious business. There's 5 airships. Like, that's 5 times as awesome. You know, I was like 6 years old, 7 years old, so that's where that's coming from. But, you know, played that one, loved that one. 1994 comes out. Final Fantasy III. And it quickly became my favorite game of all time, and still is to this day. You know, everything's fine, everything's good. And then, PS1, Final Fantasy VII. A commercial flashes on the screen. It's right before Christmas. A commercial flashes on the screen, and it says, Final Fantasy VII. First thing that enters our minds is not, oh, look at these cool graphics. You know, look at this guy with the spiky hair and his giant sword. To people who are new to the series, they saw that commercial and went, whoa, that's awesome. I want to play this. My family and my friends who played it, first question that popped up in our minds was, what the heck happened to 4 through 6? Why didn't we get those? Turns out, we did. In a strange capacity. We got them, but they were renumbered. And everything became super confusing. You know, I played Final Fantasy VII. This was a time before, you know, the internet is in the shape it is now. GameFAQs was it was either just starting out or didn't exist yet. So things like looking up, you know, walkthroughs was not a thing yet. So really, no one really knew what to make of, you know, what happened to 4 through 6. Give it a couple years, the internet started to take the shape that we know as it today, and we realized that the games that we were truly missing here in America were 2, 3, and 5. And that they renumbered a bunch of them, and that's why we have, you know, we have 2 and 3 that's really 4 and 6. Now, if you go on the internet today and you look up Final Fantasy III, you're gonna get this game. Probably either the iOS version or the DS version, or right now the Steam version. But you don't get this game. You know, if you look at Final Fantasy II, you're probably gonna get, you know, the one for Nintendo, most of the time the remake, Dawn of Souls, you know, Final Fantasy 1 and 2. You might get some Dissidia stuff, you know, but back then, when you looked up Final Fantasy 2 or 3, you got 4 and 6. If you looked up Final Fantasy 2, you would find stuff about Cecil, Kane, Rosa, you know, Golbez, Crystals. If you looked up Final Fantasy 3, you would get Terra, Locke, Edgar, Kefka. But then, things started to happen. Once we started to realize, there's Nintendo games that we've missed, and the translation started to get worked on, and became complete. How people would, on message boards or their GeoCities web pages, yeah, those back then, the way they were described was, this was Final Fantasy 2J, Final Fantasy 3J. There was a lowercase j next to the numbers, and that would differentiate between our Final Fantasy 3 and the real Final Fantasy 3. And you'd see arguments left and right about what you call it. When you say Final Fantasy 2 or 3, what, you know, you had the purists who are like, no, we're talking about Nintendo. And then you had the people who, you know, are so used to the American versions that are like, no, we're talking about Cecil and Terra, you know? And, it's not as heated as, you know, some of the fights we see on the internet now about, like, you know, like, frickin', I don't know, like, Xbox versus PS4, you know, stuff like that. But it was pretty heated back then. And it's just funny now that it seems that's all died down, And now when someone says, you know, I should just head on to the boss. When someone says, you know, FF2, FF3, they mean the Nintendo games or their remakes. Because Square Enix, back then Squaresoft, are no longer hiding their numbers. And what they used to be called is almost kind of just a forgotten relic of the 90s. So, that is my brief history of my perceptions of the Final Fantasy universe from the 80s to the 90s. I mean, now, you know, we're up to 15, and but back then was a turbulent time when it came to numbering. Yeah, and back then, you know, there were two things everybody talked about. FF7 Remake, like, I think right around PS3 era, you know, we started talking about an FF7 Remake. We're finally getting it. And we were talking about the numbering systems, and what we were missing. Also, back then, you never really knew what games you were missing or what games you weren't missing, because the internet, again, was still a new thing. So, we live in a different era now. When the Japanese don't give us a game, we know about it instantly. Back then, not so much. Anyway, on to what the actual game entails. We've traveled around the first cave. What happens is the four boys here, they fall into this cave, don't know where they are. You know, it's full of goblins and treasure. Oops. And we go forward, there's a... it looks like a small turtle, but it's supposed to be a giant turtle. And we have to defeat it. But I did want to start this series off with that little story, just because it, when I first played this game, was back in that era when emulation, you know, was just first a thing, translation was just fresh out of the translator's hands, and this was like the, you know, this is like going into the deep realm. Like, no one knew about this game, and so we're getting the crystal. In the remake, you have to go through pretty much the first couple quests before this happens, but in this one, they give it right to you. They give you the first jobs. So, yeah. Anyway, since I've talked my head off on this episode, more so than usual, this is going to be a playthrough of Final Fantasy III for the NES. I will say that I will compare this to the Steam version, the iOS version, or the DS version, whatever you want to call it. Do not, yeah, back then Nesticle was the big, emulator. So, I wonder if this email is actually, these guys are still around somewhere. This is a very old translation, so. But I do know Neil Corlett is still around somewhere on the internet. Hopefully he's doing well, because this game has brought me good times. So. So we're gonna sweep away the darkness. And the crystal will shine with the light of hope. Alright. So now I can change jobs. I will do that real quickly before the end of this episode. You'll notice that you don't start with Thief like you do in the other versions. Thief actually comes later. You got Fighter Monk, White Wizard, Black Wizard, and Red Wizard. 5 of the 6 classes you start off with in Final Fantasy 1. So, and it does not remove your equipment for you. You need to do it yourself. So I'm gonna do that. Actually, we're gonna switch jobs on the next episode, and we'll get this going and start our journey proper. I'll actually walk out the door too. So I hope you join me for the next one. It'll be less story intensive and more focusing on the game, but I hope you enjoyed knowing a little bit more about me when it comes to Final Fantasy and video games. And if it bored you, I'm sorry. We won't be doing this on the next episode, I promise. So either way, I hope you come back. My name is Lucklight, thank you for watching, and have a good one.